Hello, good afternoon from Berlin and good morning for our audience on the other side of the Atlantic. My name is Zorana Gajic and I am Program Officer within the European Resilience Program of the German Marshall Fund of the United States. Today I have a pleasure to welcome you to the online event entitled Toward a Democratic Political Culture, Improving Civic Education in Bosnia and Herzegovina, Montenegro, and Serbia. This event and the research that will be presented is organized within the German Marshall Fund's ReThink.CEE Fellowship program. The ReThink.CEE Fellowship is addressed to next-generation thought leaders, policy experts, analysts, researchers, and civic activists from the countries of the EU Eastern Member States, the Western Balkans, and the Eastern Partnership. One of the current fellows of this program is Ms. Dzejna Smolo Zukan, whose research and policy recommendations will be presented at this online event. Dzejna Smolo Zukan is a communication and public relations professional based in Sarajevo, Bosnia and Herzegovina, and a regional communications coordinator for the Friedrich Ebert Stiftung's Dialogue Southeast Europe project. She holds BA and MA degrees from the Faculty of Political Sciences at the University of Sarajevo and is pursuing a PhD in Balkan Studies at the University of Ljubljana in Slovenia. Her work focuses on democratization, political culture, and foreign policy in the Western Balkans. Welcome, Ms. Smolo Zukan. And we are looking forward to your presentation and our discussion today. To discuss the topic of civic education in Bosnia-Herzegovina, Montenegro, and Serbia, we are joined by Ms. Daliborka Uljarevic, a political scientist and executive director of the Center for Civic Education from Podgorica, Montenegro. Welcome, Ms. Uljarevic. And by Professor Damir Kapidzic, Professor of Comparative Politics at the Faculty of Political Science and Director of the Institute for Social Science Research at the University of Sarajevo in Bosnia and Herzegovina. Welcome, Professor Kapidzic. Before we start, a few points of housekeeping. Please note that today's event is on the record, and the recording of it will be available at the German Marshall Fund's YouTube channel. After the opening discussion in the panel, we will open up the floor also to the audience's questions and comments. Please feel free to use the Q&A function to share your comments and questions throughout the event. In a way of introduction, I would like to say a few words about this research and the paper. In the Western Balkans today, young people are increasingly turning frustration with corruption, inequality, and weak institutions into civic activism. Youth-led mobilization across the region has shown that democratic culture cannot rely on institutions alone, but it also depends on citizens willing and able to engage. Civic education is an important part of today's political life in the Western Balkans. And I will now invite Ms. Dzejna Smolo Zukan to present her paper. Thank you.
Thank you very much for the introduction, Zorana. Thank you also to Damir and Daliborka for joining us today. I'm going to start by sharing the screen to my presentation. Hopefully it's going to be useful for us to kind of track the findings that I'm going to be talking about. But before we start, I would just like to share a short introduction on why the topic of civic education. So for the those of you who are not familiar, the ReThink.CEE Fellowship allows the fellows to actually submit a topic of their own choosing that they will be working on for the entire year. And the topic that I chose for myself is civic education, but not in the general sense, but actually as part of the formal education systems in the three countries. And the reason why I wanted to work on this topic is that after being active in the field of non-governmental work, political culture, democracy for about 7 years at this point, I have the impression that we sometimes overlook the mechanisms and the tools that are already there. And one of those tools for me was definitely civic education as a school subject, as a class. I also wanted to work on this topic for a slightly personal reason, because I was a young person that went through the entirety of the education system in Bosnia and Herzegovina, and I have firsthand experiences of how civic education looks in practice for young people in Bosnia and Herzegovina, but also, as you will see, similarly in other countries of the region as well. And in my work in political communication and researching these topics in the region, I kept going back to civic education and how important it is in shaping not only the sense of rights, but also responsibilities of young people, but also each and every active citizen in a democratic world. And as we see today, democracy is not a given. It's not something that we only work towards, but we have to work also to sustain them and to renew them. And civic education is a powerful tool that can help us do exactly this. But if we decide to invest as much attention into this topic as some other topics that are seemingly at the top of the agenda, more so than these educational components. So without further ado, I will present the research of my findings. It was a comparative research on the civic education, informal education systems of Bosnia and Herzegovina, Montenegro, and Serbia. As part of this research, I've conducted desk research on existing policies, existing analysis, but also conducted semi-structured interviews with professionals from these three countries that are civic education experts, practitioners, and otherwise actively engaged in this field. So going back slightly to the introduction, but also giving some context from the region, why civic education matters here and now. According to pretty much all measurable indices covering democracy, freedoms, and democratic quality of democracy in these three countries, democracy is either declining or has been stagnating for the last at least a decade. And it's pretty much the same throughout the entirety of the Western Balkans. But please note that as I continue to talk about my research, when I say the region, I'm referring primarily to the three countries that I've covered. So Bosnia and Herzegovina, Serbia, and Montenegro. And pretty much the democratic stagnation, the decline applies throughout these three countries as well. The second reason why I think this topic matters now is that we are seeing a fresh impulse of civic energy and civic action across the region. It's been most prominent in Serbia, with the student-led protests been going on already a full year. But we also seen a brief impulse of political and civic action in Montenegro earlier this year, with also student-led protests. And this impulse of civic energy is something that could spread throughout the region, at least in the form of research and sharing experiences on why civic engagement matters. And last but not least, if not now, then when? For strong political reform and action, it's never going to be a perfectly opportune time. But as we are discussing the decline of democracy, we have to be aware that young people are learning democracy elsewhere. If they're not learning it in their classrooms, they're learning it online, they're learning it from other sources. And it is in our interest to start keeping up with the times before we realize it is maybe a bit too late. And with this conceptual framework in mind, I will go into snapshots of my findings, or the overview of my findings per each of the countries, starting with Bosnia and Herzegovina. So according to my research, Bosnia and Herzegovina has introduced civic education in the schooling systems 24 years ago, so in 2001. and it has been part of the school system as a mandatory subject in the entirety of the country. But due to the fragmented political system that the country has, it resulted in 13 different ways of, at least 13 different ways of applying civic education as part of the curricula throughout the country. So with 13 ministries actively able to shape how education takes place in the country, there's a lot of inconsistencies in terms of quality, implementation, and just the way that the general framework is applied. Even though the general framework for the teaching of civic education is in place and is relatively well developed, the implementation gap shows that it's not really shaping up the same way in practice. Quality usually depends on teachers and how well motivated the teachers are to engage with the class subject, which is usually not a lot. And it also is very much dependent on the autonomy of lower level ministries and schools themselves as to how they apply this school subject in practice. The institutional gaps are filled by civil society, as is usually the case in a lot of different topics throughout this region. The most prominent actor being Civitas, and foreign-funded non-governmental organization that has been working on civic education in the country since its introduction in 2001. They were the ones that were actively working on developing the curricula, developing teacher training methods, certification for teachers, and essentially are the organization that is acting as a quasi-institutional mechanism that supports civic education as part of the formal schooling systems. So, good idea on paper, but unfortunately lacks uniform implementation. And it's a thread that has been present in pretty much all of the inputs and research that I've received on the country. There are certain highlights, like the image shown on the right hand of the slide, which is a participatory project, Ja Građanin, or I Citizen, that is used for teaching civic education in schools in Bosnia and Herzegovina. However, due to a lack of clarity or due to the fact that there's a lot of breadth with interpretation, it's often offered as a voluntary project or something that is an extracurricular activity for students, which means that it's still not something that is systematically and inclusively applied in schools. Moving on to Montenegro, it is one of the most interesting countries for me to research in a sense that I perhaps struggled the most to find not information, civil society is there for that, but to kind of pick up the threads of how civic education is implemented in the country. It was first introduced into the educational system in 2006 as a mandatory subject, but it was downgraded to an elective subject in 2017, which has been a source of grievance primarily for the civil society that's been calling again and again for the Ministry of Education to bring back the status of the mandatory school subject to civic education. Now, why is this status of mandatory subject important in Montenegro per se? Because there are experiential evidence that since it was downgraded to an elective subject, it kind of went off the map. It's very hard to track the way it's being implemented. There are a lot of inconsistencies in terms of the quality of the implementation, but also in some schools, it's simply does not exist as a school subject. To me, it was rather unclear whether it doesn't exist because the children are not choosing it as an elective subject or because it's not being offered to them as an option at all. Maybe this is something that we can touch again on in the discussion. But the fact of the matter is that since it was downgraded to an elective subject, it severely plummeted in terms of its significance and the knowledge it offers to students. However, there is, as I mentioned, momentum. There is interest to change this and to have better experiences with learning democracy. The student protests that were happening since the end of 2024 to March 2025 in Montenegro, as one of the most explicit demands, had more attention to civic education in Montenegro, which just goes to show that there is a recognition that civic education matters when it comes to learning democracy. And this is something maybe to keep in mind when we address the further findings later on. Last but not least, and probably a country that is now in the forefront of discussing civic engagement, Serbia. Serbia is also a country that shares some similar grievances with the other two, but has a specific issue of its own. And the specific issue of Serbia when it comes to civic education is that civic education was introduced to the schooling system as an elective subject and as an alternative option to religious education, which immediately confronts students from a very young age that there is a false choice between being a good believer and being a good citizen, as if these identities are mutually exclusive. Due to different factors, only about 1/3 of students attend civic education classes because they choose to. And in general, the success of civic education and the quality of civic education is limited to motivated teachers in schools, which are there, which do exist. But in general, the lack of recognition on the importance of civic education and why it should be mandatory, at least in some way, for all children to attend is still not there. I covered kind of all three countries with a quick snapshot, but when I was researching all of them, there were several structural challenges that were common to all three and that are pretty much a common theme, whether it's Serbia, Bosnia, or Montenegro that we're discussing. Civic education in general is a school subject that has low priority, and educational reform as an overall topic has very low institutional priority in all three countries. Even when there is somewhat of a commitment for educational reform or call for an educational reform, it rarely moves past this announcement, or it is rarely a transparent and inclusive process that offers space for civil society watchdogs and other interested experts to engage actively with it. Another very large issue that I kept coming across is that the teacher support frameworks in all three countries are very poor. Teachers are unmotivated, not for a lack of their own will, but because there are simply no mechanisms to support them and to make them more motivated to take on civic education. For most of them, it's an added obligation, sometimes even a punishment, but there is rarely any supportive mechanisms to help them conduct civic education classes. Even when there are support mechanisms, they are supplied by civil society organizations, which simply shouldn't be the case when it comes to systemic solutions. Civil society organizations have other topics and areas of expertise that they can and are also actively engaging, which puts a strain on their resources and puts a strain on other activities that they're conducting. In general, as with most topics, I fear when we're discussing Western Balkans, fragmentation and political interference kept coming a lot when I was doing my research, in a sense that appointments of school directors, appointments of people who are making day-to-day choices when it comes to implementing civic education in schools are sometimes governed by rather behind the curtain decision-making processes or have implied expectations when it comes to the teachers that are being appointed. Last but not least, the overall challenge seemed to be that there is a large discrepancy between the theory that is being taught in school and an overwhelming lack of practical knowledge that the students are gaining when it comes to civic education. They're bombarded with facts and they are expected to learn very abstract concepts from a very young age without any practical teaching that would kind of help them connect these theoretical concepts with the everyday lives as citizens within their societies. Moving on to a very general or maybe a very superficial overview of my recommendations that I offer in the paper. I'm a very big fan of trying to have a comprehensive goal structure. So I try to work within the framework of short-term, medium, and long-term goals when it comes to improving civic education and what could be done. Of course, more detailed recommendations are often offered in the paper, especially when it comes to country-per-country analysis, but going through them very quickly. The most basic thing that we can start doing already now is to raise more awareness of why civic education in school matters, why it's important as a school subject, and why we should all pay more attention to it, especially when it comes to engaging parents and getting their support for civil society actions. In the medium term, we could look at the recognition of non-formal learning, which seemed to be very important to a lot of civil society practitioners when it comes to civic education, and simply introduction of more practical components in teaching. Last but not least, of course, the long-term goals, the ones that would take the most efforts would be the institutional ones, which would require involvement from decision-making bodies. But those goals would be primarily targeting the support and motivation mechanisms for teachers. So more efforts on institutionalizing teacher certification and teacher development programs, more clarity and prioritization for status of civic education, and kind of working towards that subject not being simply a space filler for the timetables in schools, but actually something that is very actively integrated into the democratic culture that a school should ideally have. In the interest of time, I'm going to kind of close here with two thoughts that stuck with me for the entirety of my writing process. One is by the American philosopher John Dewey, who said that democracy has to be born anew every generation, and education is its midwife, which I think very strongly encapsulates what I was trying to achieve with my paper. And second one, on a more pessimistic note, by Hannah Arendt, that it is somewhat difficult to take a crisis in education as seriously as it deserves. I thank everyone who's attending today, because it shows to me that there are interested audiences that take education seriously as a topic, and I look forward to the rest of our discussion. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ms. Dzejna, Smolo, Zukan, and please, for our audience, feel free to use the Q&A function to share your comments or to raise questions. And now I would like to invite Ms. Daliborka Uljarevic to comment on this presentation, please.
Hello to everyone. Thank you very much for this opportunity to discuss the civic education, which is often forgotten in our societies and also in the wider discussions. And it's not simply an educational subject, it's a pillar of democratic culture. And I would also say a test of political maturity in our society, which we failed to pass for quite some time. So let me begin with the MS paper, which I find both well structured and deeply relevant, especially in the current momentum, which is rather turbulent, and with the challenges that we are facing, which are also a consequence of the lack of the civic education in the formal education system. I think that her main argument that civic education across Bosnia and Herzegovina, Montenegro, and Serbia exists only on the paper, and that there are some ambitious but actually weak implementation is very important, because this gap between the design and practice is precisely what makes this subject politically invisible and socially ineffective. And I will not go into the into the details of the paper, but I would say that it's very important that she is actually addressing several systematic causes, because if we do not address systematic causes, we are not nearing the some of the solutions that we are looking for. And this is both referring to the position of the subject in the schools, professional standards for the teacher actually there lack, and the chronic absence of the political will to treat civic education as a strategic reform area. And it just came to my mind because Emma has finished her presentation with several quotes, and there is a quote of Alexis Stockwell, who was also referring to the civic society and saying that, and I'm now rephrasing, I'm not using the original quote, but it's very important in this context, because he was talking about the reserve of certain regime towards the active and awakened citizens. And this is what actually civic education is forming. It's forming the citizens who are actually all the time awakened. They're looking what's happening. They're trying to react, and they are informed. And this is one of the, I think, reasons why this subject is not wanted in our region. Why? Because our political structures do not want that type of the citizens. And this is again another argument that we need to push for it. And this is also what Emma was referring to, that it's basically outsourced to civil society, because civil society understands its importance while the institutions are neglecting it. And we became the main provider of civic education, also training teachers, developing materials, etc. And even though these are valuable contributions, this is not a long-lasting solution. And we have seen how donors' tendencies could change, and that it can seriously affect a lot of the good ideas and initiatives and the NGOs. We are for years in Montenegro striving to have civic educations back on the track that it has been in 2006 when it started. And I would like to say that the enthusiasm that existed in 2006 with this subject was really great. I think that a lot of the students have been choosing the subject. It was very appealing to them. You asked partially what happens now, why it's not chosen as the elective subject. I think that we are living in a different period. I mean, a lot of the things should have been actually changed even before it became elective subject. First, the entire, we have this workflow also in the education system. A lot of the good teachers have left, and this subject has not been taken seriously enough, because students do not want the theoretical classes. They want something which will be very practical. And I think that due to the lack of the professional staff, we ended up with the students who are not choosing it, even though they do recognize its importance. I think that this has been seen also in student protests Kamusutra, which were at the beginning of the year. Unfortunately, due to the tragedy which happened in Cetinje, and one of their major requests, which is relevant for our discussion, was a reinstatement of the civic education as a mandatory subject. And this demand was not only symbolic. I think it was a cry for the competence, for learning how to act and change things peacefully within the institutions. And their protest was very interesting, even though it lasted shortly, but it had a strong mobilization potential. And what was interesting for me, and I see that also in some of the phases of the protest in Serbia, is that these protests placed education, not the ideology, at the heart of the democratic renewal. I mean, we never had before protests of the students in the region which were actually dealing in this systematic approach. They were usually very clear with a very concrete requests, which were most frequently dealing with a certain change that could have actually be reached immediately. And this is, we see, a long-lasting process. And I think that one of the messages that they have sent is that democracy must be learned, not just inherited. And if you see the motto behind me, this is also the logo of our organization. Democracy is to be learned. It's the ongoing process. And this is how we are actually trying to create the environment where activism, critical thinking, and dialogue will be encouraged and not penalized, because we still have this atmosphere in the region and of course in Montenegro that you should be silent, that somebody else will do the job for you, and that you shouldn't be the one who will be objecting publicly. So in that sense, the student protests in Montenegro are also closely connected with civic awakening we have seen in Serbia. We'll see how it will at the end develop, but whatever happens, these protests had its historical importance in many aspects. I will not go into that now. And I think that it's important to know that the students in both of these countries learn democracy by doing, by organizing protests, communicating with the authorities, building these solidarity links between themselves. And these are actually civic education outcomes which have been achieved outside of the school system. In Montenegro, we have seen a lot of these activists being previously active in civil society or passing through the educational programs, meaning that there is an important motive to have the civic education in the schools. We are currently working on the project which is funded by the UNICEF. We are trying to make both the baseline study where we are and some kind of the action document with the recommendations. And we do have the minister who is positive towards this subject, but now we have a new danger. I have been so much proud in the previous period that Montenegro had only civic education, not religious education in the formal education system. Now we have a real danger of the introduction of the religion education for the multi-ethnic, multi-religious society. This can be really a dangerous element which will further undermine the civic concept of the state. So just a few things to make this to come to the end. I think that it's very important that we insist that civic education must be experiential, not theoretical, that we have very concrete proposals how to shift these methods, how to have participatory approach in the schools, how to help the teachers, and as embedding civic education in long-term education strategies is crucially important for the overall sustainability of the society. On the other hand, there is also, this is where I'm concluding, Emma's paper reminds us that democracy cannot sustain without informed citizens. We see some of the consequences of uninformed citizens with whom you can easily manipulate by the developments in last 2 days in Podgorica. If you maybe have followed up with this outburst of the violence and hate speech against Turkish citizens living here. And these are some of the examples that we can see on everyday at everyday level and in each one of our countries. And we are now at a crossroad whether we will actually opt for producing generations that are politically passive and vulnerable to manipulations, or we will actually restore some of the core democratic practice where civic education is very important, and have a democratic culture which is capable of resisting to that and capable of actually producing progress that is based on values. And one important thing, Emma was talking about EU integration process and civic education. Unfortunately, we see that EU integration accession negotiation process at the moment is more trade-off business. It's transactional not value-based. And it would have been better if it is value-based, and we should fight for that, because technical benchmarks will not change our society, but introducing some of the benchmarks which are actually linked to the civic society will. And the ultimate aim is, at the end of the day, that we change the societies, not the formal membership, which will actually bring us with all our troubles into the EU. I'm sorry if I was a little bit longer, but this is a very inspiring topic.
Thank you very much, Ms. Uljarevic. I think in our further discussion, we might come back to the question of EU enlargement in the Western Balkans and connected with the civic education. I just want to remind our audience that you can use Q&A function to pose your questions. And now I'm inviting Professor Damir Kapidzic to comment on Emma's presentation. Thank you.
Thank you very much, and thank you for this inspiring presentation. And I mean, when we talk about the topic of democracy today, we sometimes have difficulty to understand what it is that we're talking about. Especially more recent surveys among youth show that democracy is not supported anymore as such, just as a concept. Even though some of the basic elements of democracy, like accountability, like responsiveness, those are still well within, enjoy large support. But the basic question of, is democracy working for you? Most youth say that it isn't. And one question, I have not found a survey on this so far, who does democracy serve? I think that that question would yield tremendously bad results for democracy. To keep it short, democracy today is seen as an elite project. And this goes into what Daliborka was saying. Any education about democracy cannot be the same kind of education that we have had so far. And Emma's paper does a really good job at telling us what we have so far so that we know where to move on from that. Today's world is not the world of the 1990s or early 2000s, when there was a consensus about liberal democracy, more or less globally, when there was a strong push and strong support for civil society to, take that role of educating for for democracy as such. And democratic civic education that was built throughout this time, it presupposed that nothing would change. It presupposed that, things would remain the way they are, but the world does change. And today we see, on the one hand, with democracies being captured, democratic institutions being misused against their own citizens, the whole concept of democracy suffers from this element. We see this in the US, we see this throughout Europe, and especially here in Southeast Europe. Now, what is important in all of this? The formal part of education, the learning about democracy, yes, it has to happen in schools, because all of the informal learning that we can witness on a day-to-day level, it's limited. It's limited to only those who are interested. It's the same thing that you have when you call for be it a protest or be it some kind of mobilization. It's difficult to mobilize everyone. Most people are not interested in learning about democracy. And that's a fact we have to deal with. This is why integrating it into school systems was such a big win, because at one point, everybody was learning about democracy, but it was learning about democracy as it was 20 years ago. And this is still what we have today. So it's sort of balancing out this new form, this informal way of mobilizing, of getting connected, of deliberating between each other about what kind of world, democratic world you want to have, versus the more stale kind of learning of what democracy was once upon a time ago in an idealized world. Within all of this, we're also forgetting a very important element, which is the role of social media. Today, people learn, and ChatGPT and AI as well, but mostly social media. And people today learn about the world not from their teachers, but from their phones. They don't even learn that much of the world from their peers as much as they do from their phones. And this kind of learning, it's very much an audience-based learning. They are not subjects that take part and that discuss ideas. They are just, recipients of various kinds of ideas. And this is something we have not built into our democratic learning, whatever the country we're talking about. Right now, with this, let's say, stronger integration of AI into the classroom, into teaching, we at university are now struggling of how to keep this both contained, but then also to make it useful, because it's not going away. This is something that we have not thought of in our democracies at all. So trying to use these kinds of new approaches while thinking about how to expand the reach of democracy and still keep it interesting for everyone is something that I think we need to tackle with. Emma's paper sets the groundwork for this. It sets us up to do this next step of thinking about how to move forward. And I don't think that we can rely on our governments to do this, by the way. This is, again, something that we must do both within educational institutions, but then also together with civil society, and try to reform the way that we teach people about government and about democracy and about their civic role. I'll stop here and open it up for discussion.
Thank you very much, Professor Kapidzic. We already have a few questions from the audience, and I will read the first question. And I think it would actually be best if Professor Kapidzic will answer this one. How influential are disinformation and misinformation methods in undermining civic education, especially from governments that don't want to adopt democratic traits such as transparency and accountability?
So if Emma agrees, I can respond to this. I mean, Emma is also perfectly well positioned to do so. And in this particular question, it's all about trust. So both disinformation and misinformation undermine the trust in our education systems, in our government systems, and in democracy. And by doing so, they essentially undermine what positive actors, let's call them, versus malign actors are actually trying to do. If you question the basis of trust in a society, and this is what disinformation and misinformation essentially do, you undermine the basic tenets of a society as a functional whole. The civic in civic education needs to be there, and this undermines the basis of having a civic sphere.
Thank you. I will read the second question from our audience, which I think Emma, Dzejna, Smolo, Zukan would welcome because it's related to the educational reform. So how could advanced civic education courses in schools be designed to align with the interests of political stakeholders? For example, if civic education placed greater emphasis on preparing young citizens for active participation in political parties, might this encourage political organizations constantly in need of new young members to support stronger and more practical civic education in schools?
Thank you for the question. Let me put it this way. I don't think that it is ever going to be in the interest of political stakeholders to work on the theoretical knowledge of responsibility and accountability that enables active citizenship, because political parties are interest organizations, and as such, are not necessarily going to be aligning with the general concepts of what we find right or just or necessary for a society. Political organizations already have recruiting tools. They have political academies. They have other means of targeting young people and getting them to engage. From all of the knowledge that we have and what surveys are showing, the only interest young people in the Western Balkans that have the only interest that young people have right now in joining political parties is unemployment. So this is already a strong push factor for them to be interested in working with political organizations. And it seems to be working so far for everyone, because I don't see really even the political parties changing their recruitment tactics in this sense. So when it comes to advancing civic education in schools and how they should be designed, I would go back to what Professor Kapidzic mentioned previously, which is the civic in civic education. So my biggest push and what I put into the recommendations of my paper is that this needs to be student-led. It needs to be participatory exercise in building and already living civic education within schools. I perfectly agree with what was said by our input givers, in a sense that we need to rethink in general how we are teaching civic education, but I don't expect this to come from political parties, regardless of their necessity for recruitment and getting new people to engage with the work of political parties. It's also at a certain point a self-fulfilling prophecy, in a sense that they keep telling young people to engage, but nobody questions the kind of the prerequisites of how the game is being set up in the first place. So I think these two maybe phenomena should, for the interest of working towards something constructive, maybe be kept apart, at least within the theoretical framework, because I don't think that the political stakeholders are going to be the ones who will drive this process forward, so to say.
Thank you very much. We have two more questions from the audience. The next one, which might be for all of you, you will decide who wants to answer. What topics should be included within the scope of civic education? Should it encompass subjects such as law, taxation, and political party engagement, or should it focus primarily on the philosophical and theoretical foundations of democracy, authority, and political systems? Who would like to answer?
Maybe
Emma.
I could start, and then Damir and Daliborka could engage as well. So currently it focuses on the latter. I've analyzed all curricula that are currently in effect in all three countries, and it's split up into like topic groups. And what for me was really odd is that the first groups of questions and concepts that kids as young as age 10 learn is what is authority, or what is governance, or what is a constitution. At that level of age, regardless of how good definition you give to a young person, they are not going to relate to it to the same extent as an adult would. So I would argue that the second portion of topics, or the first one that you suggest, such as law, taxation, political party engagement, would fall into the category of maybe more practical skills that children could learn, or at least how these policies affect them. But I don't think they should necessarily feature as units within the curriculum. My genuine wish is that young people and students should have mechanisms of deciding what they are going to be teaching. And this is not something that's completely out of the box. It's being done in schools already. One of those examples I've listed in the paper, it's in Croatia. They have a form of civic education where the teacher essentially asks children to detect topics and problems within their local communities that they want to work on. And then they learn all about these theoretical concepts through very practical issues and challenges that they see in their nearby surroundings. You don't have to necessarily teach someone the definition of authority to explain authority to them. I would even argue that they're going to understand it better if they learn about this in a very practical example. And these practical examples and these projects that they are very actively engaged on also teach them stuff as law, stuff as taxation, and even political party engagement when they start discussing on their ideas. Like one of the ideas that I've heard from the educators that I was interviewing is that young people wanted to have a park near the school. And that was their initiative. They wanted to have a park. They wanted to have benches and swings. And through trying to implement this or pitch this idea to someone, they learned how local community works, how municipal governing bodies make their decisions, who is in power in their local municipality, so what political parties are actively engaged. They learned what the authority is, and they learned more about participatory democracy than, for example, I ever did when I was given a textbook and said, learn this by heart, and this will be your guiding book forward. So I would say it's experiential learning of everything that you listed, but in a way that's going to be led by students, not necessarily by what is written in the curriculum.
Thank you. Daliborka, Damir, would you like to comment on this question also?
I can say a few words. I think we need to have certain curriculum because these are the obligations of the formal education system if we are talking about that part. So that cannot be something that should be improvised. But I think that curriculum should be more based on the outcomes than the exact topics. The topics could be actually put in a wider spectrum. So in that sense, students should learn through civic education how to think critically and act responsibly and to engage constructively through their communities. And the goal is not only to transfer the knowledge about institution and rights, because they will be learning about that through different stages and different other topics. And also just one thing that Emma was talking, I mean, we do have this subject, at least, I mean, we are hoping that we will have it reinstalled in that way, both in the elementary and high school. So it's not the same also approach that should be done in thematic way. But on the other hand, both of these should be learned to develop the skills, values, and attitudes that make democracy work in everyday life, or if it doesn't work, that they have these skills to react. And practically, they should require practical skills such as, peaceful conflict resolution, nonviolent communication, creative expression, rhetorical abilities, all forms of literacy. And we didn't mention also digital literacy, which is very important, and how they actually act responsibly within the digital sphere. And also, it should help them to understand and experience what it means to be active members of their school or wider community. So, I mean, in shorties, it should be learning through practice, whatever these topics are taken and however they're structured, but that this is done in the appealing way for them, that they are not actually sleeping at the classes or choosing the subject only if they assess that there is some professor that it is so easy to pass with, but that they go there with a smile.
Thank you. Professor Kapidzic, would you like to comment? Not at this stage. We have two more questions. I will read both and then would ask our panel to address them. The first one says, who defines who is the good and who is the maleficent actor? And the second question, are there any differences in access to civic education in rural areas compared to urban? Emma, maybe in your research, did you touch about the differences between urban and rural areas?
Yes, so maybe we start with the second question. Thank you for the question, because it's something that is I would say a really strong argument as to why we need to pay attention to the formal schooling system. There are differences in access to civic education because a large portion of it is supplemented by civil society organizations. And civil society organizations, by the nature of their work, do not have same access to all students as the formal schooling system does. They're mostly limited to working with students who are there voluntarily, which is what research shows, mostly urban youth. So this over-reliance on external actors to contribute to civic education is what is creating the inequalities. As far as the civic education as a school subject goes, I would say there aren't necessarily differences, but with the special caveat that all children, so rural and urban alike, are receiving a very poor version of civic education through the current classes that they're having.
Yeah, if I can just add something, I mean, when we are talking about access to the education, to the civic education, rural and urban areas, I wouldn't make a particular difference between civic education or the other forms of the education. We do, of course, know that it's less accessible in the rural areas than in the urban, but it doesn't mean that we cannot have certain form of that. But very important question, and this is something that it is that could be used by the opponents of the civic education when you ask who is the authority to define who is good or bad actors. Because the opponents of the civic education would like also to present it as the indoctrination subject, and in fact it's not. It's not the teacher, the government, or textbook that is actually learning you to who is good or bad. The purpose of this subject is to tell students is not to tell students what to think, but to help them to learn to think ethically and critically. And this is maybe this ethical element is not something that we have actually mentioned enough previously, because we usually use only critical component, and some of us take it that it is also embedded into that. But I think that civic education should also cultivate value-based judgment grounded on these universal democratic principles such as human rights, equality, justice, freedom, etc. Respect for diversity, very important not to forget. And teachers are there then facilitators of within these dialogues, and somebody who help the reflection. And how do you actually judge whether something is good or bad? Maybe through the questions, does certain action respect human rights and equality? Does somebody promote dialogue, participation, social inclusion, some values, and rather than annulling that? So in that way, and this is always important maybe to underline, and it's a good question because it's reminding us on that it is critical thinking with ethical reasoning, and the values are those who are actually making the whole subject strong, and critical thinking is more like the expression of it.
Yes, I can add something to this question as well. I mean, first of all, something good for someone is bad for another, and the other way around. So it's always difficult to paint things in black and white, with maybe the exception of North Korea. Most of it is pretty much in different shades. Now, specifically here, when it comes to defining, usually authority makes definitions. An authority can be politics, can be the school board, doesn't matter. But it's not just about defining, but about learning what is good and what is bad. And that it's very difficult to do that through rote learning and just discussions. You have to experience it. This is something when people experience this actively. This is the problem with our sort of current form of teaching about civic education, that it is not experiential at all. When people experience injustice that is done to them, it doesn't matter which actor is doing this, they feel it. And they feel that it's bad. And that is something that is a learning experience. When talking about human rights, when you feel that your rights, and it doesn't matter on which side of the spectrum, political spectrum you are, from conservative to liberal, when you feel that your rights are mistreated, you feel that that's bad. And that kind of experiential learning is something that we're missing, because just focusing on charters and protections and mechanisms will not necessarily produce democratic citizens. It will produce people who know about charters, mechanisms, and various other stuff. So the problem with this is, and we touched a little bit upon it, is how to build this into a formalized civic education system where you need curricula, where you need ways to grade students that are codified. I don't have a solution to that because I don't work with education professionals, but I'm certain that there are solutions and that we can learn from these best practices on how to build this in to curricula around civic education.
Thank you. Thank you very much. I would like now to put some thoughts about the EU enlargement and Western Balkan countries on their road to European Union, and how we can connect this topic of civic education reform with EU enlargement. There is one conclusion of Emma's paper which particularly relates to this topic. So I would like to invite Emma to elaborate a little bit on this. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Zorana. Yes, I did touch on the EU enlargement aspirations of the three countries as part of my proposals. And I want to preface this conclusion by saying that the reason why I did so is that I am aware that there is a need for political will for something to happen. And in order to generate political will, you have to think a bit outside of the box. Improving civic education should be a noble enough goal in and of itself, but I am aware that that's not going to necessarily inspire a lot of decision-making authorities to act on that noble goal. Kind of expanding that and going into more pragmatic solutions of how to get about getting the inspiration for educational reform. I also looked at what are possible obligations or requirements or tools in the EU accession path that could act as motivators for decision makers to engage with this topic more proactively. Turns out civic education is connected to the negotiation chapters 23 and 24. And that could be an instigating factor for the candidate countries to pay more attention to civic education as a topic in general. We have been kind of negatively graded, talking about grading systems on political culture in EU Commission reports for years and years now. So there's definitely a need going further along in this process to actively undertake reforms that will help us improve and democratize this political culture. And in this step, we can take this goal of EU membership as kind of a guiding path and work within the framework of chapters 23 and 24 to kind of work more proactively on civic education as well. I also argued at introducing civic education and civic education reforms as part of the Commission reports could be a way to track more accountably, has anyone actually been taking up this topic as something concrete to work on. As I said, thinking about very pragmatic solutions, because that is the real world that we are dealing with. This could be one of the avenues and one of the motivational forces for decision makers in the region.
Thank you very much. Would anybody else like to comment? Daliborka, maybe?
No, I'm okay now.
I would read one comment that we got from the audience. It says, my experience with civic education and empowerment in Georgia completely mirrors what Emma just said. When youth are given responsibility and support, this is the best way for long-term engagement in their communities and battle political apathy. So even small-scale projects and funds can change a lot. This comment brings me to one of our questions for today's discussion, which says, how can young people sustain their role as agents of democratic transformation in societies marked by polarization and weak trust in institutions? Who would like to take this question?
I would try to comment just briefly on that. We have seen through all of the researches that have been actually conducted in recent years. We have been doing a lot of these researches in the Center for Civic Education concerning youth, both in Montenegro and also participating in some of the regional projects, such as the Friedrich Ebert Stiftung Youth Study Project. And Professor Kapidzic has also pointed out that there was an evident lack of the interest for the political processes and political participation within the youth population. But what happened with the protest in Serbia, what we have seen in Montenegro, and it was partially also in some of the other countries with different examples, is actually showing that we have this youth which is able to work out of the box, that there are some of the moments that could not be anticipated based on these empirical researches. And it's something that should be also analyzed in the coming period. But this is also giving a lot of the encouragement, a lot of the positive energy that we do have youth, which is able to respond in the accountable manner to the quite of a burden of the reality in which they are living, and in a way that nobody would even expect. And I think that's wonderful. I don't know where it comes from. I don't have an answer for that. I think we should support it. We should motivate it or stimulate, whatever. But I'm much more optimist when it comes to the youth now. And their involvement and engagement in the society than I was maybe a year or two ago. And I also see that some of the processes, even if they are not particularly successful or not leading to the outcome, are producing the change of the energy.
Thank you.
Maybe if I can add very briefly to that, one of the quotes from one of my interviewees that stuck with me the most was from one of the participants in student protests in Serbia. And I asked them if what they are doing now was in any way informed or shaped by what they learned through civic education about the society that they live in. And their answer was, no, we're doing this in spite of everything that we've learned. So I think this just goes to show how A, creative, and B, tenacious young people are in the region, and that they are the ones who will bring about the change. What I would maybe, as also part of this generation, caution against is that if we don't work with them, and if we don't work on transforming our knowledge of what democracy is and should be, what Damir was referring to in the beginning, we might not like the change that they bring about. So we really need to work to support young people to realize that we're actually on the same page. We might call it differently. They might no longer call democracy the ideal system that they want to live in, but what the values that we share, like accountability, responsibility, I think are still there, and we need to work now to make sure that these values are not lost in the long term.
Thank you
And
very
also,
much. Yeah, for Professor Kapidzic, you're obviously called to
also
answer.
just to add to that, so the youth that we're seeing active now are essentially those who are beyond our, let's say, ability to influence through education. They have already finished their schooling, maybe they're at university or even past university. But the generation that it comes after, so this is something that we can still influence with all of this, and essentially trying to both learn about what democracy is, but then also how democracy is lived. And the lived part is important. I think that is something that we can still focus on. Specifically, you need some kind of sense of injustice or some kind of sense of discrimination in order for people to mobilize. And this is something we're seeing in Serbia now. And especially youth have this sense that the system as it is, controlled by the generations that, don't understand them at all, is not serving them. Be it democratic or not, doesn't matter. The youth in socialist Yugoslavia back then were equally revolting against a system that was not serving them in the 1980s. Luckily, we ended up with democracy as a sort of outcome. We don't know what will end up as an outcome right now. That's worrisome. So in relation to Daliborka, I'm a little bit more pessimistic. I'm usually an optimist, but currently I'm not completely sure that we want the change that might be coming.
Thank you. One last call to our audience to put questions in the Q&A function as we are slowly approaching the end of our session. One more question for Professor Kapidzic, since you are in academia and since you have students, I guess, from all over Bosnia and Herzegovina, not just from Sarajevo. What is your impression about background knowledge of first-year students in political science department when they come from secondary education where they had some civic education? How does it look like?
Well, it hasn't changed much in the past 10 years. It's very basic. They know that democracy is, in a basic understanding, rule of the people, but they don't know how it's exercised. They know about elections and accountability, but they know that it's every 4 years and in between nothing happens. So it's in a way very, very, petrified, even like rote, memorized. They don't know how to live democracy. They don't know that they need to have an active role in it. But that has not changed in the past 10, 15, maybe even 20 years, which is a problem. Essentially, it says that our curriculums have not reformed or been reformed in the past 20 years. And I think that might be more of an issue rather than the young people's willingness to learn about it.
Thank you. Maybe Emma would like to comment on how important is the educational reform and why it matters.
It matters because the issues that we're facing are not going to go away. I think that the saying that history is the teacher of life, if history has taught us anything, is that we are very poor at learning. And I think educational reform kind of very heavily embodies that, because I don't think that there is an area of our lives that is so reluctant to change as the educational system. I think that there's a genuine fear of like touching it and getting involved with it because of what might come out on the other end. But at the same time, we have this monolith of the educational system that hasn't, I mean, most of the countries of the Western Balkans have inherited the foundation of the education system already from Yugoslavia. And it hasn't changed much from that period. And it for certain hasn't changed a lot since we transitioned into democracy. So for the last 20 to 30 years. But the world has changed so much in that time. So much so that we have very difficult abilities to even begin to fathom how young generations are going to be interacting with schools in the future, if they will be learning anything, because I hear my peers talking about seminar papers and research papers that are no longer being done by them, they're being done by ChatGPT. And this is simply the reality that we're living in. The need to reform education goes beyond the need for reforming the civic education system. It really, and I do mean this, is the way that we will shape the societies of tomorrow. And if we are hesitant to engage with this topic, or if we think of it as an issue that will resolve itself, we are simply allowing challenges to multiply through generations of young people that will go through the same education system, because the education system will stay, and it will contribute to kind of a very close circle of apathetic people not getting engaged, producing more apathetic people, and it goes round and round, and the world keeps moving outside of that bubble. So thank you very much for that question, because it really allowed me to kind of re-emphasize why I do believe that engaging with educational reform is important, regardless of what political background we come from, what our political interests are. This is simply a way to enable the functioning of our societies tomorrow.
Just continuing to what Emma has said, I mean, engaging with education reform is very important, but you do have to have right people on the right positions for that. Otherwise, it could be even worse. Because I don't think that our politicians do not know the potential of the education system, and knowing that they are actually trying to keep it in this way as it is, to produce less informed or uninformed citizens, or those who are not willing to be active within the change of the society. And let me illustrate this with the example. We got the new government authorities in Montenegro in 2020 after decades-long ruling of Democratic Party of Socialists. And I do believe that we did need a change, because this was like a necessary step towards the democratic consolidation building, but we didn't need this kind of the change that we have now. And some of the major things that have been done also in this period were also these continuous attempts to overtake the education by the, I will call them retrograde political forces. And one of the most infamous decision of one of the first Minister of Education after changes 2020 was to literally dismiss in one day all the heads of the education institutions in Montenegro, and to put those who were assessed by the church as eligible and by the new authorities. And we are already feeling the consequences of that, even though the process has had different upside downs. So it means that these forces have seen the potential of the education. They wanted to overtake it and to indoctrinate the system. So in that way, if you have the education, which will be producing, let's say, adequate citizens, adequate with the quotes, you would need to less invest into the other mechanisms to get or to maintain the power. So the fight for the education is very important, but education based on the principles we talked about, and it's very important that we keep the fingers outside of that of the politicians that we have now, because they will ruin it even more.
Thank you very much. I think in the past year, similar methods were seen in Serbia, not only in elementary and secondary schools, but unfortunately also in higher education, with many professors and school directors being fired or replaced, fired and replaced, and the consequences of these changes could actually be very dangerous for the quality of education in Serbia. Do we have any more comments from our panelists? No? Then for the end, I would invite Emma just to quickly go through the recommendations that she has in her paper. And I will then invite our audience to read the paper. The link is provided in the chat box and will be later on also shared with all the participants together with the recording of this webinar. Emma, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Zorana. So even though I touched on the recommendations also in the beginning, I will use this opportunity to maybe kind of pin down certain points. So as a first step, I really do think, even though it's a very overplayed term, I do think we need awareness. I don't think that awareness needs to be directed towards decision makers and politicians. I think what Daliborka mentioned several times is really important, that they are very unlikely to be interested in change when it comes to having more active and engaged citizens. But the people whose support we need are the parents, are those citizens who should ideally already be active in the societies and should be able to recognize why this is important for their children. Yes, civic education is oftentimes misrepresented as propaganda class to drive down a liberal agenda or whose ever agenda, depending on who's commenting. But we really need to work on raising awareness, in a sense, reframing this narrative that civic education is somehow going to spoil the brain of the children. We need to kind of work more actively on promoting the narrative that this is a class that builds skill, much like a lot of other classes are building skills of the younger generation. In a second phase, I would really argue on something that we also mentioned several times in this discussion, is the importance of experiential learning. And for the time being, until we have new and improved curricula, this can be done by taking the voluntary elements of civic education and bringing them back into classrooms. So a lot of good projects that exist in civic education, like the Ja Građanin or I Citizen project that I mentioned, like some projects that are being done in Serbia and Montenegro, are currently taken out of the classrooms. They are put down as voluntary, which means kids don't interact with them. It's something that takes away their free time. So we need to get these practical elements back into the classroom, because if we weigh the two possibilities, on the one hand, we have following the curricula to a T, which already shows us that we're not achieving a lot. On the other hand, we can try something fun and new, experiential, and even though it doesn't maybe follow the curriculum to a T, it might yield better results. The freedom to experiment with the curriculum is there. You wouldn't be necessarily doing anything that is outside of the legal framework. It would just be a more conscious decision-making process of the teacher and the school administrations, that kids should be involved in what they're learning. Which brings us to the third point, which are the teachers that are conducting civic education classes. And this would be kind of the most institutional related set of suggestions that I would have. Teachers are currently unmotivated to teach civic education for several different reasons. Some of them are the fact that civic education is not a permanent position. It's something that's an add-on class to a lot of teachers that is given to them maybe for that year, but maybe for the next they're not going to be teaching it, or maybe they will get handed something completely different in a completely different school and have to move out of that one. So it doesn't really encourage them to be sustainable about their teaching methods and to think forward on how they want to execute the class. Their certification processes are very loose. The criteria for students that need, for teachers that need to be teaching civic education are very, very, very loose and not structured, which brings about a lot of different qualities when it comes to how the class is being implemented. So teachers, as the ones who are carrying on these changes, need more support and need more guidance in making sure that young children are actually getting taught civic education in a way that is meaningful to them. So these would be kind of the three most prominent recommendations that I have, and the three that I consider to be the most implementable. Ideally, we would reform it all, but sadly, I'm forced to be realistic on a day-to-day basis. So I would really encourage anyone who is interested to read the full paper for more detailed recommendations, because I did try to expand on a lot of points that I've mentioned here today. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Once again, thanks to Daliborka Uljarevic, thanks to Professor Damir Kapidzic, and thanks to Dzejna Smolo Zukan, our ReThink.CEE Fellow. And it was really a pleasure to discuss with you on our event entitled Toward the Democratic Political Culture, Improving Civic Education in Bosnia-Herzegovina, Montenegro, and Serbia. Thank you very much. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Thank you.